All right, nearly all unit bodies are welded from front to back with the exception of the front fenders. What made Holden's initially interesting is that the front end was bolted on from the firewall forward. And this talk is going to try and determine some of the factors that influenced this. But before doing that, I want to go over some early unit body designs. Most historians tend to give the Lancia Lambda the prize as being the first unit body car, and there is an example of why it was classified as the first unit body. And so, Paul Vellicott, I haven't forgotten you. And this then shows you the nature of what it is. But there's an interesting thing. Lancia went back to a chassis on frame after this. They eventually returned to a unit body, but they did not maintain it consistently. Now, there, John P. Norby is a very well-respected auto historian, and he credits this 1903 Vauxhall as being the first unit body. It was made solely out of wood by a marine engineer who didn't know any better. And he didn't see the need for any sort of frame because boats don't have frames either. So that just sort of upsets the apple cart. Now, this car here is the Citroën, which is widely acknowledged as the first true production unit body car. And one thing I find interesting looking at this photograph, notice that the roof is not all steel. But anyway, it is recognized as the first, and it was done to a large extent with the expertise of the Budd organization. The next year, Opel came out with the Olympia. Now, this particular car actually is a cabriolet, but it still relied on the superstructure around the windows as an integral part of the body. I will be coming back to this car later. People ask, why doesn't the airflow, the Chrysler airflow and the DeSoto airflow get recognized? Well, they had a space frame. The outer sheet metal was not the source of the rigidity. It was the space frame within that accounted for the body structure. The Nash 600 is recognized as the first American unit body car. And I've had a chat with Kit Foster, a very respected SAH member, about whether or not the Lincoln Zephyr should fit into this category and would have beat the Nash. But we've not quite figured out what it was about the Lincoln that either classified it with the airflow or with being a true unit body. So the jury is out on that. Okay. Now, I want to now get into the discussion of the criteria that heavily influenced the Holden as being Australia's first automobile. Hartnett, when he saw the what Opel was doing, he quickly recognized that the future of the Holden operation, which was very similar to Fisher Body in the context, that the future was unit body. And he actually, in the same year, sent out a letter to Sir John Butters of the Australian government and basically started planting seeds that this is the future and this is where it's going. Now, when the Fisherman Benz plant was constructed in 1936, Hartnett actually designed it such that it would handle full production and manufacturing. So he was thinking way ahead. Now, during the war years, Hartnett became the director of ordnance production, reporting to the Director General of Munitions. This is a similar role to what Bill Knudsen performed for the USA, except he left the role of General Motors president to take on this government role. But the bottom line is that Hartnett managed to determine a network with the industry leaders in Australia, and he because he was obviously coordinating all their efforts in supplying munitions and military hardware. So he was able to determine really what the capacity of Australians was when it came to producing things. And just as an aside, Holden actually built an airplane engine before it built a car engine. That didn't sit well with the Sloan, but I'll explain that a little later. But in 1943, another benefit to Australia being recognized to produce cars was a internal policy governing matters dealing with post-war industrialization in overseas countries. Albert Bradley was a senior executive, and he identified Australia as the only country likely to have full manufacture in the immediate post-war era. But now there were some significant challenges that faced the emergence of Australia as of Holden going over to manufacture. Jim Mooney, who originally was hired by Alfred Sloan when he was still with Hyatt Bearings, before GM took over Hyatt Bearings, the two of them, the two men, Jim Mooney and Sloan, got to know each other well. And Jim Mooney had an incredible amount of authority in his role as head of GM's overseas operations. But he left in the war to assist in the war, and Sloan took a very dim view of this and would not reinstate him in his role after the war. So he left GM. The same fate occurred to Graham Howard. So Edward Riley, who emerged from this, did not have the kind of influence that Jim Mooney had had, and certainly was not there to help Hartnett as he tried to get Holden established to manufacture locally. The post-war outlook. Before I leave this, I should mention that if you want to understand Mooney's influence, he got Opel to produce the unit body at a point in time when Fisher Body was still using wood. So that signifies the extent to which GM overseas operations was way ahead of its North American counterpart. And it beat Fisher Body by literally a quarter of a century in that regard. Now, the post-war outlook was very, very dim. After the First World War, there were major recessions, and Germany took a tremendous amount of time to get back on its feet. GM had managed to get a tax write-off on its Opel investment, and it expected to have to repay that tax write-off if it took ownership back of Opel. So GM did not take Opel back until within a month of the actual release of the Holden car. Now, most of the Asian plants were eliminated, and the Latin American ones, while they did start after the war, they ran out of foreign exchange very quickly. So, there was no bright horizon for Riley in the GM overseas operations. The other thing is Sloan had become very wary of Hartnett. Hartnett had, as I said, mentioned, had got GM back into the aircraft industry when Sloan had battled royally to get out of it. Sloan also took a very dim view of the Australian government involved in owning railroads and government telephones, not fully appreciating the vast nature of the country and the fact that it wasn't heavily or densely populated. So these were some of the hurdles that faced Hartnett as he established it. Now, here we're looking at the Citroën unit body. Now, although it doesn't go all the way to the front, those spikes that you see over here, and hopefully you can see my mouse moving around, those were where the front suspension was attached. And it had a torque type front suspension. I'm not using the correct word. A torsion bar, sorry. A torsion bar that was located far back. So the point I'm getting at is that although this doesn't go all the way to the front, this was the real first version of a unit body. I don't have an equivalent picture of the initial Opel design, but this Vauxhall 10 was based off the same design. Here you can see these members that were bolted onto the chassis. From here on back, it was unit construction and welded, but these braces here, as well as these Y-shaped braces that you see here, were shall we say, angle iron, for lack of a better term, rather than sheet steel. And the reason for that is that the Vauxhall 10 used, as well as the Opel, used the Dubonnet front suspension. Now, in America, they had what they called the single long arm suspension, or otherwise known as wishbone suspension, for the senior GM cars, but Chevrolet and Pontiac used the Dubonnet suspension. And I thought I'd just go over this for a while because the point there's the chassis member that you saw before, the Y shape, and there's a tremendous load, torsional load at this point in time. So that gives you an indication as to why there is the need for that extra structure to concentrate this kind of a load on a sheet, on the early sheet steel would have been very, very difficult. Now, just just to have it digress a bit, this is the equivalent of the kingpin. This is where the steering laterally moved. So this entire structure moved left or right, being pulled or pushed by the steering rod. Here is your torsion bar that's enclosed within the shaft, and it's attached to this leading arm that's your suspension. So although this lines up with the pivot point of the suspension, this structure moves left and right and up and down. And then embedded in here is the shock absorber. So it was a very complex thing. Now, as best as I can determine, the reason that GM had to split between these two different transmission systems is there simply wasn't enough spring steel to produce the conventional coil springs. So I just digressed there, but hopefully now there's another reason for why I believe the front of GM's cars in the early stages were bolted on. This Opel, although it's a 1950 model, it is a direct copy of the pre-war design. This car is being prepared for shipment. Sorry for the poor photographs, but this vehicle was being it's got all its components inside here, and you can see the extremities of the box that it's about to be surrounded. Now, you have to understand that in 1935, the foreign assembly plants were used to assembling North American GM bodies that, as I said, were made out of wood and or reinforced out of wood, rather, and covered with steel. So Opel assumed that the expertise to do all the welding to create a unit body just didn't exist. Now, in Australia, they did actually produce a unit body at Holden in the form of the Model J Vauxhall. Now, just going on the last design that came out of Opel, and at that point in time, Opel was very much the center of expertise in the GM world for unit bodies. We've got the Capitaine, the Opel Capitaine, which is slightly larger than the Holden. This is looking at the chassis from above. This looks at it upside down. So this, the bottom drawing is simply the reverse of the top. Now you'll see that this is still bolted on here. You can see the bolts there. You can see the bolts there. And here you have this brace coming down from the scuttle to reinforce that. But the cars were still had this dismountable front end. There is the Holden design. And you'll notice that as distinct from the previous design, it has reverted back to the Y-shaped horizontal member, but rather than have a brace coming down, it's relied on the diaphragm effect of the inner fender. So it has advanced the design. So there have been a number of people who've claimed that the Opel Capitaine was the design that the Holden was based on. Well, that's not entirely true, because it didn't adopt the lack of a Y bracket that was in the Opel Capitaine. And if you look at this photograph that I got from Norm, there you see the Y bracket spreading its load on either side to give some lateral stability. You can't really see the metal, the sheet metal structure inside here that is taking it up. But that gives you an indication as to why Holden adopted this, why it had the unbolted front end. Now, here we have some comparisons. This is the Vauxhall that Holden actually built before the war. You can see it's slightly shorter than the Holden. The longest is the Opel, and the Holden is kind of in between. The wheelbase, which is likely the most significant structural dimension rather, is in between these two. And you'll notice that the Holden adopted the wider chassis of the tread of the Opel Capitaine rather than somewhat narrow Vauxhall. But here is where Holden really outdid itself. Look at its low weight in comparison to the other two. Yes, it has the shorter chassis, but it has a significantly lower weight. So much of the credit for this design belongs to Russell Begg. Now, he's an American. He worked at Packard, Jordan, Stutz, but most significantly, he worked for Budd. And he actually went from Budd to Stutz. And when Stutz ran into trouble, he decided to join GM. And he worked within Lou Tom's GM's product study group that looked after forward-thinking aspects of GM. And as such, he had a role there, but he also was deputy chief engineer at Opel because of his expertise in the use of unit body with having worked for Bud. He ended up in 1936 becoming the appointed as Opel's assistant chief engineer and relocated to Germany. When the war broke out, he returned to Germany, and supposedly he brought back some of these projects that GM was designing. Now, this is based on an interview given by an Australian who went to North America. I am a little in doubt as to whether this is entirely accurate, because these initial studies that are numbered in this fashion looked at whether a four-cylinder engine was cheaper to build than a six-cylinder engine, and the thinking ended up that the impulses of the six-cylinder smoothened out the four-cylinder impulses, and as such, whatever extra cost was involved in building a six-cylinder engine had to be compensated by an extra cost and having a more robust transmission. So I'm not sure that these units were they were not directly related to unit bodies. They may have incorporated early unit body designs, but at that point in time, before the war, Opel clearly was the center of unit body ideas. Anyway, in 1947, Russell Begg was appointed Holden's chief engineer, having helped them start the design of the Holden. And so here is another picture of a later Holden, and this still, you can see the importance of the sheet steel here in reinforcing the lower structure. This is not this is sheet steel here, and I show you this picture because we go over to what Fisher Body was up to. The first Fisher Body unit body was the Chevrolet Corvair, in which the front fender, or guard as the Aussies called it, was fully welded, simply because it contained a trunk or a boot. And the next Fisher Body adventure with unit body was the senior compacts, the Buick Special Olds F85 and the Pontiac Tempest. But they only did it for a 3-year span, and they obviously decided that they were going to go back to a chassis, a body on frame for the 1964 models. But it soon became evident to GM that the Ford Falcon was vastly outselling the Corvair, so they had to rapidly develop the 1962 Chevy 2. And the Chevy 2, although I haven't found pictures of it, I have it on good authority that it literally copied the front end of the Holden of the time. Now, I want to go a little bit further with this.
Louis, just to let you know, I've only got a couple of minutes left.
Okay, I'm about to finish up. The 66 to 70 Olds Toronado E-body adopted a different form of unit body. Now, there is the Chevy 2 that ended up being the copy from the structural point of view of the Holden. But here is the Olds Toronado. And you'll notice that although it had a unit body here, it has this subframe that goes all the way from the front to the pickup point for the leaf spring at the rear, and then it goes across. It also has a torsion rod suspension. So this has half a chassis, but it was a unit body. And when the HQ Holden came out, it copied the Toronto idea, because there you've got a subframe that starts from just below the B pillar and carries forward. Now, it used coil springs because it didn't have a front drive shaft, but it copied that. So that basically is my talk. Hopefully you can follow my mouse here and see the evolution of the Holden structure.
Thank you, Louis. Just checking. Jeff had just made a comment about the Teams banner. Is there any questions from the virtual or the physical audience about Louis' presentation? Okay, Norm has a clarification, Louis.
Louis,
Okay.
the HQ front frame was copied off the F-body, Pontiac Firebird and Camaro. And the story goes that an engineer came from Chevrolet with the plans for the Camaro front frame. They turned them upside down and redrew the HQ frame.
Thanks very much, Norm. Obviously, but the point I wanted to make, the Toronto in '66 preceded the Camaro and the Firebird. So, but you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about the 1970 and a half Firebird and Camaro. Or what you would call 1970 model, but it came out 6 months late.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I didn't realize that it was a direct copy.
Cool. Any other questions or points at all before we break for a quick recess? No. It sounds like everyone's on board, Louis. It's all clear as day. We'd like to thank you, Louis, for your second and fascinating talk then. So if everyone could give Louis a hand. Give a virtual clap. I'll do a virtual clap. There we go. We've got to do some virtual stuff as well. Look, in terms of our schedule, we're pretty much on time, only a couple of minutes over. So I really thank both speakers in the first session for really sticking to that time frame. We've got some really interesting points made as well from the audience, and insights, clarifications, questions, etc. So if we can continue that kind of dynamic, I think it's going to be a really great day and night, depending on where you are. So we'll close it off now, and we'll be back at 10:10 Melbourne Eastern Seaboard Australia time. That will be for our American friends. It's 20 minutes, but it'll be 4:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time and 7:50 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US, just so you're clear about when we'll be back. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you after the break, where we're joined by Chris. I was over there for the first presentation back. Okay, I will see you all soon.